Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. My name is Professor Matthew Rimmer. I'm from the QUT Faculty of Law. It's been great to be able to collaborate on this event with some of our colleagues from the QUT Faculty of Business. I think some very productive research and public policy connections have been achieved by holding this event. Building upon the last session, which looked at various different varieties of ethical investment, this session is going to drill down and focus in particular upon fossil fuel divestment and reinvestment in renewable energy. It's my very great pleasure to firstly introduce Dr. Carol Richards, Vice-Chancellor, Senior Research Fellow in the QUT Business School.
Thanks, Matthew. Okay, so there's going to be a little bit of a change from what we looked at the first part of the session. So what I'm going to do now in this part of this presentation is bring a social science lens or a sociological lens. And I've been working on this project with my colleague here, Dr. Robin Mays, and also a colleague of ours, Professor Mike Woods from Aberystwyth University. And as we know from divestment and fossil fuels and climate change, it's very much a global issue. So it's a global response to this is quite useful as well. So I think probably the type of audience that we've got here, I might be teaching my granny to suck eggs, but the idea of divestment or any kind of action around climate change and fossil fuels is that we know that the remaining coal reserves that we have are unburnable if climate is to remain within a 2 °C temperature increase. So this means a large proportion of the coal that's in the ground or the oil or coal seam gas is unburnable if we want to meet these climate targets. And so there's a reference there if you want to follow up on some of that work. I haven't included it here today, but if you could have a look at the Do the Math by Bill McKibben, which I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with. So one of the things that we're interested in is how the government has had quite an unhealthy attachment to the fossil fuel industry and how they've been very reluctant to break that bond. So traditionally, if you wanted to be involved in some kind of political action, then you'd lobby your government, you'd look at the ways that you'd vote, you'd engage politically at that level as one of your strategies for action. But we've seen that is increasingly difficult now as the fossil fuel industry and the government are so kind of deeply wedded to each other. That we've heard all sorts of issues about donations and so forth, and very much a lack of transparency between government and the fossil fuels industry. So we wanted to look at how civil society are responding to this, and we're talking about, in terms of new social movements and new social movement theory, repertoires of actions, different ways of affecting change socially at the local level but also globally. So Robin and I, we've done lots of interviews, lots of data collection with civil society, NGOs, investors, divestors, church groups, a range of people who are involved in some way in either promoting divestment or actually divesting themselves. So what we thought was really interesting early on in this was we're seeing a shift. There's a number of repertoires of action, but we've seen a shift from what we've been talking about as this bodily form of engagement, where you turn up at the mine site physically, you lock onto machinery, or you march or protest or blockade a corporate headquarters, to a shift into a different type of politics, and this is looking at divestment. So I guess we get the gist of this now, but divestment, as we see it, is the opposite of an investment. It refers to getting rid of stocks, bonds, investment funds that are unethical or morally ambiguous. So again, it's about stigmatisation and reputation as well. And we know a number of groups who are facilitating this. Some of the key ones you'll be hearing from today, such as 350. There's other groups such as market forces. There's ethical investment firms, like we've heard from James, religious organisations, philanthropic organisations have been getting involved. So we see, Rockefeller Brothers, who knew that would happen, Barrow Cadbury, and a range of other organisations, and often, as mentioned earlier, with their roots in Quakerism from the early days. So the targets are the pension funds, university endowment funds, superannuation funds, etc. So anyway, you can follow the money from an investment into the fossil fuel sector makes a good target. So not only the company that's investing, but their associates as well. So universities are a good example. If you're engaged with an institution or you're enrolled or working at an institution that has investments in fossil fuels, then you're in a position to place upward pressure on that organisation to divest. So going back to this idea of an ineffective state, I just wanted to remind you of a few things that we remember when our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, said that coal was good for humanity, and at the G20 meeting in Brisbane, he told the delegates there that he was standing up for coal. So, yeah. We also have this legislative setting as well, where we have pieces of legislation that try and prevent action from civil society. So things like the Green Tape Reduction Act and a whole swathe of legislative tools there that aim to prevent engagement in this democratic structure that we used to take so much for granted. Also interesting, from the Australian Institute, they've produced quite a lot of figures about how much money is invested in the fossil fuel sector. So while we often hear the jobs and growth mantra and the idea of the royalties from the mining sector, that we know that a lot of major subsidies have also been given to mining, and the royalties are actually less than the subsidies given. So divestment bypasses an ineffective state in a number of important ways, and I should have asked you first if anybody had any ailments or conditions before I showed this, but it's just again to remind us that this is what we're dealing with, these very cosy relationships. Quite often they're abstract, but this is actually quite concrete, so I just wanted to remind us and put that up there. So clearly we can't go to government to ask them for change. They're too embedded in the fossil fuel sector. And this has left the divestment movement, as we've been looking at it, as engaging with markets rather than engaging in this traditional societal democratic form. So there's a term that's been around for a while about the marketisation of social justice, and we think this is what we're seeing here. So we've heard before this idea, probably from the Thatcher days, that we live in an economy, not a society. And so the engagement, the rules of engagement have been with the economy. So we can see a shift in addressing some of these major social issues through markets. And as mentioned earlier, that some of the points of interest that have been raised have been around ethics and morality and reputation. So one thing that we've heard a lot in our research is that it's wrong to profit from climate destruction. Similar to what Shen was talking about, that there's no business in abuse, you shouldn't profit from the abuse. But also, we speak in the language of corporations and big business, is also this idea that these assets are going to be stranded and it's a poor financial risk. So if we think of 80% of the coal that's in the ground cannot be burned, then we start to think, actually, are we investing in assets that are eventually going to be stranded? So there's been a two-pronged approach, at least, that we can see. And I've put a little example in here of some of the things that the people have said to us, but we're trying to disrupt the relationships that the financial markets hold with the fossil fuel companies. So again, like Shen mentioned earlier, it's about that disruption, about breaking down that relationship. There's some interesting ways to do this that we've all been looking at. The adoption of new strategies that rests quite significantly on symbols and icons, and we have some great symbols and icons to mobilise in this space. So if you think about the Great Barrier Reef, that has, although it's adjacent to the proposed Carmichael mine, it also is internationally significant. Everybody knows about the Great Barrier Reef. So that's a very good symbol and icon. So when you've got something that's as amorphous as carbon, that's again intangible, it actually makes it quite concrete and gives you a fantastic tool to convey the values around environmental destruction and preservation of the Great Barrier Reef. Similarly, another symbol and icon that's been deployed in this debate has been around Indigenous rights as well, so the rights of First Nation peoples around the traditional owners of the sites where the mines are proposed. So a lot of these things, they're meaningful to us because of Adani and because we're in Queensland, but if you're overseas and you have investments in fossil fuels, it might be less tangible if we're just talking about carbon and climate change. So I just wanted to show you some of these images that have been around that we've been collecting. So we have there the traditional owners from around where the Adani mine is proposed, and also one of the protests there where we see a lot of symbols and icons around the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So you see people with fantastic hats with the coral reef and fish and all sorts of things hanging off there, is to draw attention to these different icons and symbols. The other thing that we think is quite interesting in bypassing the state is this globally coordinated Toolkit Activism. There's probably other terms for it, but in particular we've seen the work of 350 And so instead of having to start from scratch on your own in isolation, there's a globally coordinated movement that you can tap into and get the tools that you need to start a campaign. So we find that's quite interesting. And this is something that's mediated through social media as well, which helps these global connections. Also interesting, I'm using the term convergence space that's from a geographer called Routledge, but this is a way that the movement has been mainstreamed. So previously, you'd have the kind of messaging that these are kind of the loony left, you know, needs a good haircut and a proper job, who are protesting at mine sites. They can't say that anymore. You know, you've got Desmond Tutu involved, and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund involved, and the Rockefeller brothers, and so a range of actors who don't necessarily have an awful lot in common normally. So it's not just the green left that are in this space. So we're seeing lots of organisations and institutions involved in this. I've mentioned some of them below, but the list seems to grow daily, and you can follow that on the 350 Go Fossil Free website as well to see who's actually divesting. So you see a range of actors there. And I quite like, there's some nice iconography around the religious groups that's involved. For example, in blockading at the Leard Forest, in wearing their various denominational outfits. It brings quite a lot of gravitas to the campaign. I know we've been talking about the campaign successes and not always about the amount of money that's divested. There's a lot of, again, symbolism involved in here. There's interesting aspects around stigmatisation and reputational damage to some of the companies that's involved. This is a piece from 2015 that talks about the Commonwealth Bank and Adani parting ways. So you can see that there is some response. You know, it's not kind of going out into thin air and evaporating, it's actually landing, and people are making statements about this. We also see, I think, a success in my mind is the fact that it has mainstreamed, that it's jumped scales from those local people who are locking on at mine sites to a broader society globally. And you can see a list of the banks there who made commitments to divest or to not invest in the Adani mine in the last couple of years. And things have perhaps gone a little quiet now. It'd be worth having a look and to see if they're going to stick to these responses that they made at the time. Also interesting then is the capital that's actually been withdrawn. 350 claims about 3.4 trillion, if you did want to put a number on it. So it's in terms of its monetary value, but I think the value is actually beyond the monetary value. We're also looking at this reputational harm as well. And there's another example. So the picture I showed before of the Indigenous people standing outside of Standard Chartered Bank, this was Standard Charter's response, saying that clearly this, they're not going to impact upon the First Nation peoples or the traditional owners. So it's kind of interesting because these are distant places. You know, this has been in New York and London, but our own Indigenous people seem to have more rights outside of Australia than in Australia when you look at things like this. So as Market Forces claimed, this leaves Adani without a partner in the banking world. So we'll see where that stands as this campaign gets reignited. Just for fun, I thought I'd show one of the latest news pieces. So this is our Vice-Chancellor of QUT, and you may or may not know that QUT committed to divest a couple of weeks ago. And so, of course, there's been some flack from the Liberal National Party. No surprises there. But this is just, again, to remind us of how wedded the fossil fuel sector is, that they'd stand out and say that we actually want the Vice-Chancellor to be held to account about this. You know, it was clearly political. It's not about finances. So the fight continues. But I've put this in the success factor column because I think if they're going after vice-chancellors, then I think that we're in an interesting space and there's actually some traction being gained here. So just to conclude, then we've got the non-mining businesses and organisations such as the finance sector that are more responsive to the reputational risk than our own government. I think that's quite telling. So obviously that's where the point of pressure has to be at the moment. We think that divestment has been an effective target to leverage change, and it's also bypassed the state, which is quite a curious thing. But we also have noticed ultimately that you do need the state's involvement. Many of the campaigners do talk about using these kinds of strategies to recapture the state's attention. We need the state to actually back up investments in renewable energies, for example. So what they're doing at the moment is creating a blurring in that area where people are not sure they can invest in renewables in Australia, whether it's a good bet or not. I think I'll just leave it there, and yeah, I think I'm done. Thank you very much.